SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Dear learners, I welcome you in this course Research and Publication Ethics. Today, I will be discussing on publication practices and committees. My name is Dr. Nirbhay Kumar Mishra. I work as an assistant professor at Department of Applied Sciences and Humanities at JLA University, Mathura. Before we move further, let's try to understand what we did in the last lecture. So we tried to understand the idea of publication ethics. We analyzed the importance of publication ethics in research practices. We discussed some case studies to understand further about the publication misconduct. We critically examined the role of responsible conduct in publication practices. We analyzed the authorship and contributorship criteria in publication practices. Finally, we tried to understand some important roles and responsibilities of authors, editors, peer reviewers, and publishers in making publication practices ethical. After this session, learners will come to know about the publication practices. They will understand the publication guidelines. They will come to know about the standard practices and the important guidelines for ethical research practice. We will be discussing in detail about the COPE, which stands for Committee on Publication Ethics. We will be talking about the WEME, which stands for World Association of Medical Editors. In the end, in between also, we'll try to discuss some misconduct through some case studies. We'll try to understand the problems in the research practices, and these cases I have taken from the COPE website. Okay, so learners will come to know about these all ideas after this lecture. So before we move to understand about the publication practices and the committees and the guidelines about the ethical research practice, let's try to understand what is the fresh researcher's point of view, what a researcher should maintain as a right kind of publication practice, what are the questions that a researcher must raise before he or she goes to submit a manuscript to the journal. So we'll try to discuss stepwise. These are important guidelines for researcher before he submits or she submits any manuscript to the research journal. So first of all, a researcher has to be very clear about the approvals and consent to the publication. He or she must raise certain questions like, do you have approval of the relevant regulatory authorities, institutional review board, and ethical committee? So a researcher has to be very clear that he or she has got all sorts of approval concerned with the manuscript. And then if it is a paper in medical field, so you must have approval for the medical trials also. Okay, so you must have informed consent to the experiments you have conducted to the subjects. Okay, so you need to have the approval and consent, okay, in writing, so that you can submit to the journal to maintain the right practice of publication. Further, a researcher must be very confirm about the data accuracy, where he has to or she has to ensure that there is no falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism. Researcher has to ensure that there is no manipulation in terms of the equipment, methods, or data. There should not be any manipulation in terms of the image processing in the manuscript. Okay, so a researcher has to double check for the data accuracy, for the plagiarism, for the fabrication issues in manuscript. So to maintain ethics in publication practice. Okay, so researcher must check the manuscript 2-3 times, that there should not be any issue of plagiarism, or he or she must check that he or she has not forgotten to cite the resources properly, or even when a researcher has cited his or her own references, whether the citation has been properly made or not. These are questions that a researcher must raise before he or she goes to submit the manuscript to the journal. Okay. Further, a researcher has to ensure that it should not be the case of duplicate submission. Researchers should be very ethical in terms that we should not submit a manuscript to the 2 journals at the same time. Okay, and again we have to ensure that's not going to be piece from the big data analysis or piece of paper from the big research in the form of salami slicing. Okay, so it comes under submission fraud. So researcher has to ensure these all steps before submitting a paper, so to maintain the right kind of publication practice. So again, researcher has to ensure about the ethics of authorship that we have discussed in the earlier lecture. Okay, so researcher has to maintain that the authorship has maintained properly in the manuscript in the given order. All co-authored are aware about it. Okay, they have written consent on this. Okay, and then there is no kind of ghost authorship in the manuscript, and all authors are well communicated about the authorship and contributorship, and they are consented to submit this manuscript for the publication to any journal. So in that case, a researcher has to avoid all kinds of conflict of interest whichsoever possible in the publication process, like any conflict with the financial terms, or any conflict with the co-authors, or any kind of conflicts with the reviewers or any research team. Researcher has to maintain these all steps in the research practice when he or she decides to submit a manuscript to the journal. Now let's go ahead to understand the publication practices in terms of a journal has to ensure the steps. Okay, so today we are going to talk about these 3 important committees. Okay, those who have developed standard practices, they have set initiatives and norms and guidelines for a right kind of publication practice. So we will be talking about the first Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ. Then we talk about the Committee on Publication Ethics in great detail, that's known as COPE, and then in the end we'll talk about the WAMI, that's the World Association of Medical Editors. So let's first start with the DOAJ, that stands for Directory of Open Access Journals. It launched in 2003 with 300 open access journals. Its independent index contains a directory of almost 17,500 open access peer-reviewed journals. The journals listed are from all disciplines like science, technology, medicine, healthcare, arts, social sciences, culture, humanities. Okay, so DOAJ is co-author to the Principle of Transparency and Best Practices in Scholarly Publishing, and that is the basis for any open access journal to be included in this directory maintained by DOAJ. Okay, so all journals have to accept this as a criteria, that is the Principle of Transparency and Best Practices, in order to be indexed in DOAJ. So the mission of DOAJ is to increase the visibility, accessibility, reputation, uses, and the impact of quality peer-reviewed open access scholarly research journals across the whole world. Regardless of disciplines, geography, and language, DOAJ is trying best to maintain transparency, maintain a quality peer-reviewed open access directory, so that researchers can have information about the good quality open access journals, those who maintain transparency and follow the right kind of research practices and guidelines. Okay, so DOAJ actually works with editors, publishers, and journal owners to help them understand the value of the best practice publishing and standards, and DOAJ applies those practices to their own operations. That's where DOAJ actually plays a great role in terms of open access publishing is concerned across the whole world. DOAJ provides a solid ethical basis to all researchers to understand about the best guidelines and best practices, and they can actually target good quality open access journal, and by this directory actually they can also save themselves from the predatory journals. Okay, so that's where DOAJ is really doing the great job in providing these guidelines for open access journal across the whole world for the research community. Let's go ahead with the Committee on Publication Ethics. Committee on Publication has done a great job in terms of developing the standard practices and guidelines for journals, for authors, for reviewers, for publishers. So let's try to understand from the famous quote by the COPE. COPE may not prove useful in the long term, and we will be delighted if it is made unnecessary, because the international profession produces an adequate response to research misconduct. So, unquote. So in 1997 to 2003, it has 90 members when it started. Okay, then we see the developments in COPE in terms, right? We see that Fiona Godley became the chairman. Under her chairmanship from 2003 to 2006, we see some developments that codes of conduct of the COPE for editors published. Okay, authorship criteria guidelines also published, and there was a member survey done during her chairmanship. Then we see more further developments from the period 2006 to 2009 under the chairmanship of Harvey Markovich. Okay, so Markovich tries to provide the flowcharts and the mechanism of COPE for the editors, publishers, authors, and from the 2009 we see the developments in terms that publishers started joining COPE as a member. They sign up, and the journals, they join the COPE. Okay, so let's try to understand in brief about the historical developments of the COPE. So from 1997 to 2003, first COPE meeting happened, and they had the written constitution. So by 2000, COPE had over 90 members, and the constitution was drafted, and Mike Farthing was elected chair. So from 2003 to 2006, we see a code of conduct for editors and authorship guidelines issued by the COPE. And from 2006 to 2009, we see COPE became a charity, and publishers, journal publishers, that joined the COPE as members. Okay, from 2009 to 2012, we see COPE started, developing this, ethical culture of publication across the whole world. COPE started, hosting seminars and the conferences to clarify the misconduct issues in the research community. So we see the start of international seminars and e-learning courses. From 2012 to 2016, we see the growth in membership of the COPE, and there was seminar, hosted in South America and Europe by the COPE. And from 2017 to 19, we see that COPE started translating its resources in different languages, and it hosted China seminar, and the COPE guidelines was translated in Chinese language. Okay, on 2019 onwards, we see a new different strategy adopted by the COPE is to give a DOI to each of its document. Okay, and now in 2021, they had the vision that universities will become the member of the COPE. So further, let's try to understand the vision of the COPE, what COPE is trying to do in this research community across the globe. So COPE is basically trying to develop ethical culture in terms of publication practices. Okay, it has a vision, it has an aim to move the culture of publishing towards one where ethical practices become a normal part of the publishing culture. So the COPE adapts the approach firmly believes in the direction of influencing through education, resources, and support of our members, alongside the fostering of professional debate in the wider community. So COPE tries to develop the ethical culture in publishing through the seminars, debates, cases. Okay, so COPE is try to make this research community understood that there are ethical ways of publishing, and we should avoid misconduct, and there are guidelines and norms how to make our publication ethically fit as a research activity. So COPE is very important in terms of it issues its core practices. Okay, so from 2017 we see this development in COPE that the code of conduct replaced the core practices. Okay, so now when you go to this website of COPE, you find these core practices. So the core practices should be considered alongside specific national and international codes of conduct for research, and are not intended to replace these. Okay, journals and publishers should have robust and well described, publicly documented practices in all of the following areas of the journal. So we have to understand all countries have their different national, international codes of conduct for research publication. Along with that, there are COPE guidelines which clarifies to the author, reviewer, journal, publisher what is the right kind of conduct in terms of publication practice. So COPE tries to develop in that direction. So let's start with the core practices which are mentioned on the COPE website. So I have taken these from the COPE website itself. So they talk about the allegations of misconduct. Okay, so according to COPE, journals should have a clearly described process for handling allegations. However, they are brought to the journals or publisher attention. So anytime anybody is observing any kind of allegation, so journal should have a clear cut mechanism to handle such misconduct issues, allegations. Okay, journal must take very seriously these allegations of misconduct before publication or after publication. So there should be clear cut policies how to handle allegations from whistleblowers. Sometimes within the journals, any editor, any reviewer, or any staff member of journal finds something going wrong in terms of publication practice. So journal has to be very stringent criteria how to handle a whistleblower's allegation that arises within the journal. So journal has to have the very clear cut mechanism to handle this kind of misconducts. Moving further to the guidelines on authorship and contributorship, COPE put emphasis on this point that there should be clear policies and that allow for transparency around who contributed to the work and in what capacity. So there is emphasis on that there should be clear-cut policies and guidelines by the journals. So to explain what is the criteria of authorship and contributorship. Okay, so clear policies that allow for transparency around who contributed to the work and in what capacity should be in place for requirements for authorship and contributorship, as well as process for managing potential disputes. And then if any conflict of interest occurs in the process of publication, the journal has to be a clear mechanism how to handle that conflicts, what is the communication criteria, and what kind of technological equipments which are used in terms of software to manage this kind of issues by the journal. So let's try to understand kinds of misconduct they occur for the journal in terms of a case study. Okay, so this case study is listed on COPE itself, okay, under consideration also. So we will just try to understand that what kind of misconduct occurs, okay, during the publication process, and how COPE advises, okay, certain solutions to the editors and publishers to sort out those problems in publication practice. So let's take this case study. This is a very interesting case study, because this is a case study where an author, submits a manuscript to the journal. Okay, during the submission whole review process, okay, he or she himself indicated as the corresponding author. So during the submission, review and revision process, and also through copy editing and proofreading, the corresponding author responded to all emails, signed the publishing agreements, and was generally available. At this time, the authors of the manuscript did not mention a possible change of the corresponding author to editor in any communication. Okay, so the manuscript was published online and as an article in Press Online first, without volume or issue, okay, number, but with a DOI. Okay, so however, after 5 months, okay, in this case, as just mentioned, the paper was published online. The authors of the manuscript asked the journal to change the authors of the manuscript, okay, and or corresponding author of the manuscript, but author who communicated for this change, okay, in terms of corresponding author, did not provide any clear explanation, reason, or justification. Okay, so this kind of misconduct sometimes is problematic. Okay, I mean it occurs. Okay, so there were 2 questions for the forum. First, how should the journal act? Should the journal change the name of the corresponding author after this length of time? Would such a change be considered an erratum or corrigendum? So we have to understand first of all what Cope advised also in this case study. It is not in the capacity of editor to decide on this complicated issue. Okay, that's why I discussed in the very beginning that a researcher has to be very clear, okay, in terms of this step before submitting any research manuscript to the journal. Okay, a researcher himself or herself has to maintain this kind of ethics in publication practice before getting into this sort of problems. Okay, so what can be the possible solution? Cope advises on this is that editor may ask to all the co-authors, okay, they should give in writing about this change and what are the possible reasons. There may be 2 possibilities. Either it was kind of manipulation by the authors, or it can be a correction that went wrong earlier in the publication practice. So anyhow, it requires a thorough process by the journal in terms of asking in writing to the all co-authors to give the reasons, justifications to make this change, and this this has to be even this should be published by the journal as a notice or erratum. These are the solutions are possible. Still this case is going on, so the last decision will be the Cope's decision, right? So after this case study, we understand very clearly that a journal should have a very proper mechanism to address such issues, to respond to complaints and appeals. Okay, so journals should have a clearly described process for handling complaints against the journal, staff, editorial board, or publisher. That's for sure that a journal should take it very seriously, all the complaints, appeals, and the issues of misconduct, and journal responds it carefully, reasonably through a proper mechanism that journal has maintained. Okay, so when any conflict of interest, competing interest, it occurs during the publication process, so there must be very clear-cut definitions. Okay, what does it mean of conflict of interest? Okay, and journals should have a clear process of handling conflicts of interest. Conflict of interest can occur with the authors, with the reviewers, with the editors, with the journals and publishers. Okay, so a journal should properly identify before the publication or after the publication any kind of conflict of interest, and they should respond it very well. Okay, if it occurs during the publication practice. Now let's take another case study that's also a very interesting case study. Okay, So in this case study, okay, so this is also about a kind of a publication practice where some changes were requested. I mean, some changes are there, and we have to understand how to handle these cases when they occur in the publication process. So this is a case of where an associate editor invites a reviewer to to write a commentary, okay, and then when this commentary is published, then this associate editor also listed as co-author, okay. So there could be the appearance of a conflict in the decision to accept the article on which the commentary was based if the associate editor is an author on the commentary, okay. So the question arises here is it ethical for the associate editor to author a commentary on a manuscript they handle? So it's clear, seems a kind of bias, okay, how an editor, okay, becomes a co-author. So how COPE advises, okay, in this case, the forum agreed that it is not necessarily unethical for an associate editor to author a commentary, okay. So it can be reasonably correct also, but in this situation the associate editor and the original author of the commentary need to explain how the associate editor came to be a co-author. So of course, if there is any conflict of interest, there should be clear-cut justification, reasons should be offered to explain the conflict of interest. Conflict of interest doesn't mean that it is a case of misconduct, okay. Conflict of interest simply shows the conflict, and a conflict can be resolved if author or editor or reviewer or any staff member to whomsoever this conflict of interest occurs in publication practice, if they can offer justification in terms of good reasons, okay, and if those reasons are convincing on ethical grounds or on the grounds of the publication guidelines and practices prescribed by the journals, then of course it can also be considered as a right kind of practice as a publication practice. So further, which is very important step as a core practice, okay, defined by the COPE, that's about the data and reproducibility. So data is of course a very important aspect of producing any research, okay. So journals should include policies on data availability and encourage the use of reporting guidelines and registration of clinical trials and the study design according to standard practices in their discipline. So of course we have to mind this, the data is very important. In terms of data, we have to always ensure that a journal has to have a very good check on the plagiarism, and a good journal has to have the mechanism to check the fabrication issues also and falsification issues also. In that way, the reviewers have to be very very competent to check those issues, especially when it comes to the medical journals where the image manipulation cases are more because of this technological convenience, okay. So data and how the data is reproduced, that's very important concern in the publication practice, and for that reason journal should have very clear-cut policies on handling the data by the journals. So now coming to the next point, which is also very important, on the ethical oversight. So also the core practice listed on COPE, okay. So ethical oversight include, but it's not limited to, policies on consent to publication, publication on vulnerable populations, ethical conduct of research using animals, ethical conduct of research using human subjects, handling confidential data, and ethical business marketing practices. So of course we have to understand, as we have defined earlier also, that research practice is not only a practice for commercial objectives or commercial reasons, but research practice is of course a socially responsible practice. So we have to connect ethics not only with the author guidelines, okay, contributor guidelines, okay, in terms of resolving the conflicts, okay, in terms of the data issues, okay, or in terms of handling the research subjects, human subjects, or the vulnerable population, like we have discussed, a patient, okay, or a pregnant woman, or a child, or an old age person that depend on our care, right, in the medical care fields, okay. We have to be very careful to the ethics to the particular people, particular class, okay. Moreover, we have to be concerned about the environment, society in that way also. So a journal has to have very clear-cut ethical guidelines for the publication practice, okay, and that guideline includes not only the publication practice but also how that practice can affect the society and vulnerable classes and the practices there. A good research ethics has to be developed by the all journals. So coming to the next important core practice about the intellectual property on COPE. So journals should have the all policies on intellectual property, including copyright issues and publishing licenses. They should be clearly described by the journals, okay. In addition, any cost associated with publishing should be obvious to authors and readers, okay. So there are some cases where journals don't mention the cost of publication initially, okay, and the journal looks fine in terms of the informations and the details, but later on when your paper is accepted, then you received a message from the editor that you have to pay certain amount for the publication, and that is predatory sort of thing, that's predatory nature of the journals, and that's really wrong. So journal has to be clearly mentioned, right, any cost involving the publication clearly to the author in the itself, the publication guidelines, author guideline, it should be mentioned. So policies to be clear on what counts as pre-publication that will preclude considerations, what constitutes plagiarism and redundant overlapping publication, and these all things should be specified very clearly and transparently by the journals on the journal page. Now let's talk about the very important thing, that is about the journal management, okay. So a journal management is complete comprehensive process that that's very important for research publication practice also. So a journal has to have a very well described and implemented infrastructure, okay. That is very essential for a journal, okay, including the business model, policies, processes, and journal should be technically governed by a good software, so to provide efficient services in terms of the informations, data, everything, okay. So for efficient running of an editorially independent journal, they have to have a good software technology, as well as the efficient management is required, and journals should provide a training to the editorial members, editorial boards, and reviewers and the staff, those all who are involved in publication process. So of course journal management becomes a very crucial aspect in research publication practices, managing research publication practice, and the more important is how a journal manages peer review process. That's really important step in research publication. So all reviewers first of all should be competently selected for the review process. They should be well trained in the reviewing the papers, and they should be competent in their research fields. So all peer review process must be transparently described and well managed. So there should be transparency in terms of the reviewership, right? And then journals should provide training for editors and reviewers, and they should have clear-cut policies on diverse aspect of peer review, okay. So you have to understand, you train the review in terms of there are many things, okay, in terms of the how a reviewer checks the data, how a reviewer checks the tables, resources, plagiarism issues, and data fabrications, image manipulations, okay. even the justifications of the data, use of the data. So reviewer has an important role in terms of managing a manuscript, and reviewer has serious ethical responsibility to go through the publication or manuscript, okay, because he has to make certain checks involving all kinds of checking the all kinds of misconduct. A reviewer has got serious responsibility in this way. So a journal must have a good diverse training for the reviewers, okay. They should always hire good reviewers, okay, competent reviewers, those who have really such skills to check all the research manuscripts in that way. So journals should adopt, they should, especially with respect to adoption of appropriate models of review, okay. So they should have appropriate models of reviews, okay. They should have a proper system of review also, and process of handling conflicts of interest we have discussed earlier also. So how conflict of interest has to be handled by a reviewer, that mechanism, that structure has to be well defined by the journals, okay, and how reviewers will handle the appeals and disputes, okay, that arise in peer review. So this requires a good structure, a mechanism by the journal, okay. It requires also a good training of the reviewers, and it also requires the selection of competent reviewers who those are trained to check all kinds of misconduct in publication process, okay. Now that's a very serious point, post-publication discussion and corrections, okay. So that's the sometimes this ethical retraction also comes at this point, okay, when some post-publication issues arises, okay. So journal must allow debate post-publication either on the site through letters to the editor or an external moderate site, okay, such as PubPeer, okay. They must have mechanisms for correcting, revising and retracting articles after publication. That's very important, and there we also see the developments in kind of pre-print archiving, okay. Some journals like Sage and those, they have started this practice, right, where you can submit your paper before publication in open public discussion, okay, where the interested researchers, they give certain comments or certain reviews on a paper, so that you can modify those changes and you can actually develop your research in that way, so to increase the acceptability of a publication, so to correct your paper in terms of the research. So that's a very good trend and practice that has been developed in recent times, that is known as preprint archiving, okay. So like preprint archiving, we should have the post publication forums also, like we are going to talk about the PubPeer. That's interesting group, okay. Let's try to understand what is PubPeer, okay. So PubPeer is a foundation based in California, okay. So it's a non-profit corporation, okay, in the United States, okay. The goal of this foundation is to improvise the quality of scientific research by enabling innovative approaches for community interaction, research community interactions, okay. The bylaws, the foundation establishes, okay, the service run for the benefit of its readers and commenters, okay, who create its content. Our content focus, so the content, PubPeer focuses on maintaining and developing the PubPeer online platform for post-publication peer review. So if we take these two, developments, now that's really very good developments as pre-archiving system by the journals and this PubPeer. If we, combine these two, that creates really good platforms for researcher to correct many things, to develop many things in terms of making research publication practice as a right kind of practice. So of course, for making ethical culture, what is envisioned by the COPE also, we need to develop this kind of trends. We need to develop this kind of platforms and forums where we can actually not only correct our thesis, we can correct our research papers, we can correct our manuscripts, okay. It adds certain developments also, because we receive comments, we receive reviews, we receive corrections, and that is for the betterment of the good research practice. So of course this pre-archiving system and PubPeer, they are playing a good role in terms of good research publication practices. So let's try to understand about the WAMI. Okay, so WAMI stands for World Association of Medical Editors. Okay, so it's a global non-profit voluntary association of editors of peer-reviewed medical journals. Okay, so let's try to understand the professionalism code of conduct by the WAMI on its website. What they mentions that medical editors should pursue lifelong learning and teaching, both formal and informal, and they should recognize the need to remedy knowledge defects in themselves and their co-editors. Okay, so of course WAMI has this goal and vision to understand the knowledge deficits, okay, and try to cover those deficits in terms of right kinds of practices in publication. Okay, so let's try to understand the WAMI history. Okay, so it's established in before the COPE, okay, Committee on Publication Ethics. So it's established in 1995. Okay, so it's also non-profit voluntary association of editors of peer-reviewed medical journals, okay, from countries across the whole world. Okay, and all the editors, okay, those who seek to foster international cooperation among an education of medical journals editors. Okay, so WAMI is a collection of the medical journal editors. Okay, so they are cooperating to run in this forum. Okay, so all the peer-reviewed medical editors becomes they are eligible to become the member of WAMI. Okay, so membership is also available to selected scholars in journal editorial policy as it is defined, and peer reviewers. Okay, they can also be included according to the membership criteria by the WAMI. Okay, so WAMI has more than 1830 members representing more than 1,000 journals from 92 countries as of 2017 data. Okay, so let's try to understand the goals of WAMI. So let's try to understand the goals of WAMI. So it is to facilitate worldwide cooperation and communication among editors of peer-reviewed medical journals. Okay, so it is to improve editorial standards to promote professionalism in medical editing through education, self-criticism, and self-regulation. Further, WAMI encourages research on the principles and practice of medical editing. So further, WAMI's founding members also agreed that members of WAMI shall be dedicated to high ethical and scientific principles in the pursuit of the following common goals. Let's try to understand what are the goals by the WAMIs. Okay, it is to publish original, important, well-documented, peer-reviewed articles on clinical and laboratory research. It is to provide continuing education in basic and clinical sciences to support informed clinical decision making. Further, it is to enable physicians to remain informed in one or more areas of medicine. It is to improvise, public health internationally by improvising the quality of medical care, diseases, prevention, and medical research. Further, it is to foster responsible and balanced debate on controversial issues and policies affecting medicine and healthcare. It is to promote peer review as a vehicle for scientific discourse and quality assurance in medicine, and to support efforts to improve peer review. It is to achieve the highest level of ethical medical journalism. It is to promote self-audit and scientifically supported improvement in the editing process. It is to produce further publications which are timely and credible, enjoyable to read for all the research communities engaged in medical scientific research. So, yeah. So, further, it has certain goals to forecast important issues, problems, and trends in medicine and healthcare. It is to inform readers about non-clinical aspects of medicine and public health, including political, philosophic, ethical, environmental, economic, historical, and cultural issues. In the end, VAMIS has this important goal to recognize that in addition to these specific objectives, a medical journal has to have a social responsibility to improvise the human condition and safeguard the integrity of sciences. So let's try to understand the importance of the VAMIS in terms of the public health care and the way VAMIS, organize all the medical editors. So of course we have to understand the social responsibility in terms VAMI has these guidelines. So public health care is a very important issue in the scientific research. And there researcher has to be very ethical in terms of understanding all kinds of right practices in the publication. And VAMI also emphasize that there are other sides of public health care and medical researches which are philosophical, ethical, environmental, and economic, historical, and cultural. So of course all these scientific researchers, they have to understand that research in public health care, research in medical field, it has got serious social responsibility because it has direct impact to social health, because the way researchers they develop, they must be developed through the through a trust of the researchers. And it has to have the research integrity. So that the data or any kind of information, any treatment technique, any diagnostic techniques, any kind of medical information which has been researched and which has been developed should be original, should be ethically treated well, based on the original data, right kind of data, because it's going to create a direct impact to society, and that's where VAMI is really much concerned about these all things. So we have to take care, all the research community has to take care that research in the medical field has got serious social responsibility, and that's where we have to understand the VAMI's guidelines clearly when we go for the research and publication. So let's try to summarize the whole lecture, what we have done today. So we try to understand about the publication practices in terms of the ethics that involves in publication practice. So we try to understand what is responsible publication practices in terms of the standards and best guidelines possible and given by the some renowned forums and platforms, those who have been working hard to make this research community ethical, and they are providing good guidelines so that researchers can follow, and actually we can develop a good, healthy, ethical research culture across the whole world. So we talked about the directory of open access journals, and we talked about the Committee on Publication Ethics. So we talked about the core practices and guidelines. We analyzed certain case studies to understand the issues of misconduct. We understood certain complaints and appeals, and we tried to understand what ways the Committee on Publication Ethics, that forum, has the advices to those certain cases, what kind of solutions we can have to the issues of misconduct. Then in the end we try to understand the VAMI, and its goals, its ethical guidelines, and the importance of VAMI in the public health care and in collaborating with the medical editors across the whole world. So these are references which learners can go through to understand these guidelines. So today's lecture was primarily based on to make all the researchers aware about these committees on publication ethics. So we talked about COPE and WAME. We used all the resource material from the website, contextually to to understand the core practices, the way they have defined, the way Coop has defined, the way Swayam has defined. Okay, so that was the purpose, to make you aware about these websites and the material. So in today's lecture, we tried to understand about these guidelines. Okay, so thank you.